coming up.
Do you have any other concerns that all these changes that introduced has led to more chaos in the immigration system?
The Prime Minister talked about bad actors taking advantage of the programs, essentially blaming the problems in the immigration system on bad actors. He talked about too many colleges and universities using international student programs to raise their bottom lines. Or does the government bear some blame in this?
You shared earlier that when the temporary resident population went from 786,000 to 3 million, you called that going off the rails. In my community, there's a college that has raised their population of international students from 760 some odd to over 30,000 within a decade.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
The committee is resuming its study of the recent reforms to the International Student Program. With that, Mr. Kimmich, I'll start the watch now. Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So, Professor Emery, first, at the first meeting this committee had, we heard from officials. They mostly said they didn't know anything, but they did mention in their opening statement that the cap and the other policy measures that were introduced were because of unsustainable growth. That's the quote from them. And to reduce student vulnerability. In your opening statement, you talked about the goals that the government may have had. Could you talk about what do you think the goals the government had in putting on the cap, and whether do you think those are the right ones, or do you have different goals that should be reached?
Professor Emery.
I'm going to focus my response from the perspective of the Atlantic region, which I think has a different context from, I think, the cap, which was addressing more of an Ontario-centered problem with the massive growth, particularly in colleges. Atlantic Canada has had increasing dependence on international students, but not at the same rate as the rest of the country. And in New Brunswick in particular, it's only been the last couple of years that we've seen what I would even call large growth, but it's not particularly large compared to what you see in some cities in Ontario. So as a consequence, the challenge with the cap is that the first mover, Ontario, has done a lot of this expansion in a way that it seems like it's had some pretty negative consequences. So the cap, in a sense, makes sense for Ontario, maybe for the large cities, but it is hamstringing the opportunities for other regions like Atlantic Canada to sort of test the waters to see, are the students more effective for staying?
Thank you, Professor Emery. I'm just going to interrupt you. I wanted to ask you that, do you think a one-size-fits-all policy for all of Canada is the right approach then?
Of course not. But it's the one that has often been used for a number of things, including climate policy. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we get a one-size-fits-all policy, because that's sort of what sells across Canada, but it doesn't work for the Atlantic region.
So, Professor Emery, do you think this is going to harm Atlantic Canada and its universities and college systems?
I think it will put a lot of strain on the university and college systems in terms of the labor market. It's not clear to me what the bottom line impact will be, because we also depend on in and out migration, which could include international students from other regions.
So, Professor Emery, do you know if any of the governments or the universities or colleges were consulted before these changes were introduced?
I'm not privy to those kinds of conversations, so it wouldn't be fair for me to speculate what role they might have had.
My next questions are Professor Worswick. I was going to ask about this absorptive capacity that you spoke about. Do you have suggestions on how that would be calculated?
I mean, I think what I'd like to do, I actually submitted a grant application on Friday, and what we'd like to do is use the surge of the population we've seen over the last 7 years to try to estimate it empirically. But I think that there are things you could do without going to that much trouble. Like, people have compared growth in the housing stock to the growth in the population. So if you see that housing is not growing proportionally with the population, that would be, a sign that that this could be an issue.
So you mentioned at the end of your opening statement the case of fraudulent applications at the Immigration and Refugee Board, but there's also other instances of fraudulent activity. We learned at the last meeting of this committee that up to 10,000 fake acceptance letters fraudulent acceptance letters were identified by IRCC. So this was, big business. They said that it was only in 1 year. This is only after they had introduced this two-step or another layer of security on it. Do you have any other concerns that all these changes that introduced has led to more chaos in the immigration system and especially in the processing of applications?
I mean, I think that when you change policy and programs too often, there's going to be confusion and uncertainty. But I think there was an issue of just the volume of people coming into the country. And so I think cutting back on the volume coming in is probably going to help. But it isn't really my area of expertise. So.
Speaking again back to absorptive capacity, there's a lot of people that, and again, you mentioned in the opening statement, there's a lot of individuals who are seeing their work permits expire, their study permits expire, they don't have an opportunity for renewal, so they're choosing to, and this is being reported in the news, that they're choosing to go and make applications to the Immigration Refugee Board. Does that speak to anything else in like more chaos? Will we see that keep growing and there'll be even more questions as to the absorptive capacity of Canada, or you will have people who will be waiting perhaps years before they'll know whether they'll get permanent status in Canada and all the uncertainty related to it, the types of jobs that they will take on, the survival jobs they'll take on in the meantime?
Mr. Warsworth.
I think ideally, you would want an international student system, temporary foreign worker system, where the people coming in realize that they're here temporarily and they would leave if they're not eligible for permanent residency. I think what you're saying is true, that there obviously are processing limitations. So, I mean, one could consider extending the work permits, I think, temporarily, given that, again, this isn't really my area of expertise, but it strikes me that we are in a moment of tremendous expansion of our international mobility programs, and we're now trying to ratchet them back down. I would not be averse to saying maybe extend these permits for a year or two, but beyond that, I think either the immigration system should be able to process all these applications, or people should be leaving if they no longer have a legal right to stay in Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kimich. And I will go to now MP Ali.
From your perspective, how might this shift and the recent shift to the international student program contribute to the integrity of Canada's immigration system?
Professor Warsworth.
I think that these changes were needed. So, both on the immigration front, the temporary foreign worker front, and the international student front. The international student was probably the most problematic sector in the sense that it had grown the most. And so I think the targets are, I think our challenge right now is we have a stock of temporary residents in Canada that's very large. And so, I watched the Prime Minister's video, I guess it was released on the weekend or maybe late last week, and they were relating it to the long-run trend of the population and trying to get back. And I think that's not a bad way to think about it, is to say, we're way off trend. How do we get back to it? Well, one way is to let the temporary resident visas expire. The people who aren't eligible for permanent residency go home or on to somewhere else. And then we get back to a sustainable system. So that all makes sense to me.
And now we will go to Mr. Reddy Cobb for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Warswick, I just wanted to clarify something. You talked about when we bring immigrants in, we should be raising the average skill level. You talked about average wages and things like that. And you seem to imply to me that universities, for sure, colleges, and private, not often. What about polytechs and some of the jobs that are, like some of the trades jobs and some of the areas where we have great needs and wages are very good? Are you saying that we shouldn't be bringing people in for that?
No, what I'm sort of suggesting is we should make the decision for allocation of international visas to higher education institutions based on expected earnings. So if the polytechnics you're talking about, if the graduates have high earnings, then we should allocate international student visas to them. And maybe there are programs at universities that don't meet that criteria. I think we need to the way we use the comprehensive ranking system for immigration, I think we should try to develop something that's similar for international students. Because otherwise, I just think lobbying and politics are going to just drive this, and we're going to end up placing international students in the wrong institutions. And I do think we have absorptive capacity issues. So I think we're constrained in that regard. Our healthcare system just can't expand fast enough to handle the kind of volumes of people coming in that we've had.
1 minute, Mr.
Thank you. Mr. Emery, the Prime Minister talked about bad actors taking advantage of the programs, essentially blaming the problems in the immigration system on bad actors. He talked about too many colleges and universities using international student programs to raise their bottom lines. He talked about scammers targeting vulnerable immigrants. Do you agree with the Prime Minister that it was the designated learning institutions, the universities and colleges essentially, they're to blame for the fraud and the errors that happened in this program, or does the government bear some blame in this?
30 seconds, Mr. Emery.
It sounds to me like there's been a failure of oversight in the implementation of who had the right to invite students in. I don't believe universities were abusing it to the degree we saw in some of those private colleges. So I think it's a regulatory failure or a policy failure.
Okay.
Chair, I'd
I
like to
have
ask,
Mr. Morris.
thank you, Chair. Asking for unanimous consent from colleagues for a minute and a half of questions.
All in favor? All good? So I will give Mr. Morris 1.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. Professor Warswick, wanted to share with you why this is of particular interest to me. You shared earlier that when the temporary resident population went from 786,000 to 3 million, you called that going off the rails. In my community, there's a college that has raised their population of international students from 760 some odd to over 30,000 within a decade. And so that has had significant impacts in my community. You spoke about the ability to absorb. The ability of my community to absorb that population growth has been challenged. My question for you, over a year ago, I put forward a number of measures that been able to work with the minister on. Some of them have been put forward. A number haven't. And so I'm looking to continue to build support for these. I'd like to put one of those to you, and that is to have designated learning institutions that have more than 15% of international students who never actually enroll in a course. That there would be maybe a limiting of visas from IRCC to those DLIs. That's something that a number of countries have already done around the world. Canada hasn't yet. Is that something that's on your radar already? And is there a comment you'd like to share with the committee on a proposal like that?
Respond.
It seems like a very good idea to me. I think there's a real concern that our international student program at times is turning into a de facto temporary foreign worker program, which is not the intent. So I would support what you've told me about it anyway.